Order, order. Dr. Julian Lewis to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Sir David, and it's a pleasure to be able to introduce this important subject of investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel under your chairmanship. Now, I must say that my interest in this topic was first sparked by contributions made at an end-of-term debate by my honourable and gallant friend for Beckenham and my honourable and gallant friend for Filton and Bradley Stoke, both of whom are with us today, although one of them, sadly, as a PPS, cannot contribute personally to the debate. And the Defence Select Committee agreed to look into this question, and we delved into it very much from a point of view of what was technically possible and what was impossible to do for reasons of international law. And when we look back at the period of the Troubles, and we are solely concerned with that period from the beginning of the Troubles in 1969 to the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, there were 3,260 Troubles-related deaths. Of those, 238 were the result of engagements by military personnel. So we have over 3,000 deaths. We have over 200 involving military personnel. And what was exercising the concern of the committee particularly in the context of what had happened with soldiers being brought to court as a result of the much more recent campaign in Iraq, where thousands of potential cases appeared to be having to be investigated, and yet at the end of long and tortuous and expensive processes were finding to be without much or indeed any substance in the vast majority of cases, was a concern that a similar sort of process was now going to begin retrospectively in relation to those 238 military deaths that had occurred during the period of the Troubles. And in the course of the inquiry that we held, we took the advice of a panel of 4 distinguished lawyers who gave us evidence. And I drew a number of lessons from what they had to say. What they were telling us was this: it is possible, if it is decided, to draw a line under the events of such a long period in the past and so long ago, it is possible to do this. But what they assured us was not possible under international law was to do it in a selective fashion. They were quite clear that there are 2 conditions that have to be met if we wish to bring in, as the committee felt we should bring in, a statute of limitation concerned with Troubles-related deaths up to the date of the Belfast Agreement. And the 2 conditions were the one that I've already alluded to, which is the need that it must apply to everybody, and the second condition, which is a requirement under international law, which is that there must be a proper investigative process of deaths which have occurred, even though that may not lead, and indeed if there is a statute of limitations, that definitely would not lead to a prosecution. Now, I started to discuss this with various interested parties. The Democratic Unionists with whom I discussed this certainly want there to be a statute of limitation applying to the military forces, the police, and the security agencies. But they have grave difficulty with applying such a statute to former Republican paramilitaries. Only yesterday, and for the first time, and I welcome it, I was given the opportunity to have a discussion with the 3 of the Sinn Féin elected MPs to this Parliament. And they were interested, I think it's true to say, in something that already seems to apply to Republican paramilitaries, but they were not interested in something that would apply to the military, the police, or the security agencies. And there is a certain lack of clarity, to put it mildly, about what the present policy is. Because, and we discovered this in our discussions yesterday, there was a genuine failure to agree, even on the facts, as to whether the limitations that already exist on the sentencing that can be applied to convicted paramilitaries apply to service personnel as well. What are those existing restrictions? Well, I think we know what they are. As part of the agreements that have been reached after so many years, so many negotiations, so much death, so much tragedy, and so much trouble, it was agreed that no matter how great the offence, no matter how many the victims, no matter if you had killed dozens, scores, or even just a few individuals, if you were convicted under the terms of the agreement, and if you were a paramilitary, you could not be sentenced to more than 2 years in prison. So the likelihood is you would not serve more than 1 year in prison. But there seemed to be no agreement, and I don't know if the Minister will be able to enlighten us today. If not, I hope he'll write to us definitively, as to whether this restriction applies to the military. The Sinn Féin MPs definitely thought that it applied to the military. And yet, I had it previously explicitly put to me by a lawyer for one of the service personnel currently facing trial that this 2-year maximum limit, no matter how heinous the offence, to which a Republican or presumably any other paramilitary can be sentenced, did not apply to the military. If it does not apply to the military, I think it's a fairly safe bet that this total imbalance between unlimited sentences that could be imposed on soldiers, as opposed to a 2-year sentence and 1 year of that served in jail, which can be imposed on paramilitaries, is something that is so egregious that it is hard to imagine that, at the very least, the government would not seek to impose a cap for all who may be affected by any proceedings. But I want to try and take a wider view with this, and I want to appeal to all the people who are involved in one way or another in the tragedy that was the Troubles of Northern Ireland, to try and take the broader view. Now, it's been put to me in very stark terms that people who suffered losses during that period, even if it was only 40 years ago, cannot rest until these matters are resolved. And I share their understanding of this, because in my own case, I can perceive something of what they feel, because in my own case, my family was caught up in the Holocaust, and all that part of it that was still in Poland in the Second World War was annihilated, with the exception of one very small family unit that was saved by courageous non-Jewish Poles. And I know that I felt for years after the war, even though this happened a few years before I was born, I felt for years after the war that the people who did this should be hounded forever. But that is not the situation that we face today, because we have already decided that in the interest of an overall settlement, there should be a limit on the maximum sentence that can be faced by paramilitaries of no more than 2 years. And so by no stretch of the imagination can the punishment be said to fit the crime. Now, I want to come now to the second element of what the distinguished professors told our committee when they were advising us about what would be possible and what would not, as far as international law was concerned. And that was, they said, that as well as any statute of limitation having to apply to everybody, because if you apply it only to the forces of the state, then you are legislating for state impunity, and that is illegal under international law. They said as well as that, it must be coupled with a truth recovery process. And I think we all know where we first began to hear about truth recovery processes. We began to hear about it in relation to what happened in South Africa after Nelson Mandela came out of prison and after the changes that occurred, and the decision that was taken in South Africa to draw a final line under all the horrors from whichever side, from whatever part, from whether it was state authorities, whether it was revolutionaries, whether it was innocent civilians who had been caught up in someone else's crossfire. They decided that it was in the interests of the peace and coherence and the possibility of building some form of united community after the event. They decided that a line must be drawn, but that families must have closure and they must have the best possible opportunity to find out the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. And that was how you had a situation when people came forward who had been involved in terrible activities, who gave testimony, secure in the knowledge that even if they were incriminating themselves, they would not be prosecuted, and how there was some form of resolution for those people who had been bereaved in the sense of public accountability and discovery of the truth. Not only was it a brilliant and magnanimous concept, it was also, as we know, a legal requirement. There is a legal requirement to investigate. There is not a legal requirement to prosecute. Now, the trouble we have in a situation in Northern Ireland, and I hope I will not strike the wrong note by seeming to be flippant at this point, goes back, of course, to the origins of the Troubles in 1969. And I went to university the following year, 1970, and while I was at university in Oxford, I made a friend called Martin Seif. You might just deduce from his surname that he has the same sort of background as I do. And I remember him trying to explain to me the depth of division between the communities in Northern Ireland. And he said, for example, he said, there was one occasion when I found myself cornered by a gang in the street. And they asked me that age-old question, are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic? To which Martin thought he had the perfect, truthful answer. He said, I'm a Jew. Yes, they said, but are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew? Now, I am not trying to be flippant about this. I am trying to indicate that there are irreconcilable and deep-seated beliefs at work here. In the role of the Defence Select Committee, our concern has to be for the welfare of the service personnel, and we do not wish to see circumstances where hundreds of old cases are reopened, even in the absence of any new evidence, which means that they are highly unlikely to be successfully brought to a conclusion if you regard it as being successful in terms of getting a conviction. But nevertheless, people are put through a tremendous ordeal at a late stage of their lives, and at the end of it all, in the vast majority of cases, it will almost certainly be found that they did nothing more than their duty and they didn't commit any offence at all. So our concern as the Defence Select Committee had to be, in our report, to make a recommendation about what should happen to these personnel. And we were unanimous in believing that a statute of limitations making any troubles-related offences or alleged offences up to the date of the Good Friday Agreement should be enacted. We felt it is for the government of the day to go wider and decide what other groups besides service personnel and associated police and agencies ought to be included in that. But we did not shy away from pointing out that the unanimous expert legal advice we received from the 4 professors made it quite clear that if a statute of limitations was going to be introduced for anyone, it had to be introduced for everyone. And this is what is going to be very difficult for the different parties on that terrible divide in Northern Ireland, which we are seeking to repair, to accept. The unionists take a view that some people should benefit from the statute of limitations, but not others. The Republicans take a view that others should benefit from a statute of limitations, but not the people that the unionists want to see benefiting from a statute of limitations. I am going to go as far as I can without breaking any personal confidences, and it may be that I'm misinterpreting the signals. But from my conversations with people on either side of this argument, I sometimes get the impression that they are held captive by the response they feel they have to make to the people who elected them and brought them to this House. But I sometimes detect, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps I'm misreading the signals, I sometimes detect that in their heart of hearts, they know that there is either going to be a solution for this issue which applies to everyone, or there is going to be no real solution that applies to anyone, but they will never be able to articulate it or to promote it. And I believe that it is a step forward that the government has said that it is going to hold a consultation, and that in that consultation, the possibility of a statute of limitations will be one of the options aired. And I also believe that sometimes you must seize the opportunity to take a lead. And there is nothing of a legal nature to prevent this Parliament from enacting a statute of limitations, because if it applies to everyone, if it is coupled with a truth recovery process, it will maximize the chance of people finding out what happened to their loved ones, and it will maximize the chance of avoiding the poisoning of the settlement so far reached by a constant succession of cases being brought before the criminal courts. But there is another factor on which I wish to end, and which I hope the Minister will take back to his colleagues in the Northern Ireland office. And I was particularly impressed by it with in the meeting that I had yesterday with 2 other colleagues, 2 Labour colleagues, in fact, and I met the Sinn Féin MPs. And from their point of view, it seemed to me, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting what they said, it seemed to me that one particular ongoing issue was the failure to hold inquests into the deaths of many of the people who died during the Troubles. And I just wonder if we could set to one side this route of trying to get to the truth by having a succession of old men with insufficient evidence against them nevertheless being dragged through the courts, if as part of an overall settlement we could all decide to go ahead with a statute of limitations applying to everybody, that might then open up the possibility of inquests being held So a combination of inquests being held into the deaths that have so far not had inquests, and a truth recovery process when people know they can come forward and say what happened without any danger of incriminating themselves, that might not be the basis for a step forward. So David, in concluding, I would just say this. Today's debate is just one piece in an enormous jigsaw that people have been trying to put together in order to come to a conclusion that could enable the communities in Northern Ireland to live at peace with each other, and, as far as we're concerned, to ensure that soldiers who did their duty are not hauled through the court years after the event when no new evidence is available. And I do hope that people don't have too great an expectation that the production of an individual report or the holding of an individual debate will do anything other than add to the momentum. But one thing I think the Defence Committee can claim is that we have focused attention on one specific remedy that does offer a way forward. If it was a way forward with no disadvantages, then of course people would have signed up to it or something similar long ago. There are disadvantages to every policy you could do, and people are going to have to make sacrifices. And people do make sacrifices, and people have made sacrifices. And the question is it better to go down the route of endless court hearings and deepening divisions and poisoning of the links that have been slowly and gradually been building up of a more positive nature, or is it better to take a leaf out of the South African book? And I conclude just with this thought. After all that he went through, after all the people that he represented went through, if it's good enough for Nelson Mandela, shouldn't it be good enough for us and the Northern Ireland communities too?
The question is that this House has considered the 7th report of the Defence Committee investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel and the government response as on the order paper. Ruth Smeeth.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. As ever, it is a privilege to follow my chair on the Defence Select Committee and to be rejoined by some of my former colleagues who served on the committee in the last Parliament as we discuss this issue. I don't intend to speak for long, but what I do want to do is talk about the people and why we need to handle this so delicately. Many colleagues will want to be aware that there are families who have been touched by this issue sitting in the gallery today. Every time we look at the issue of Northern Ireland, we need to remember this is about people on all sides of all communities, as well as the serving personnel who currently serve, who may want to serve in the future, and who served during the Troubles. This impacts every part of our military. And for me, I stand here today as chair of the Armed Forces Covenant Group, because it is that responsibility that we have raised within the conclusions and recommendations from the report. Given the current political situation in Northern Ireland, there has probably been, not for a decade, a more difficult time to raise these issues. And I do not envy the new Secretary of State, my neighbouring MP, the MP for Staffordshire Moorlands, in the way she's now got to deal with some of these challenges as they come forward. I don't think any of us would want to make that job more difficult in the months ahead as we try and work towards a political settlement in Northern Ireland. But these issues have an impact on people across the country, including our constituents who are ex-serving personnel. There is not a veterans' brunch or breakfast that I will visit. I have members of my own political party who served during the Troubles, who have regularly raised this with me, and by regularly I mean monthly, raise their concerns with me about what this may well mean for them as they approach their 70s and 80s, and the concerns that they may have legal action hanging over their shoulders. As hard as it is for the families who are still suffering the legacy of the Troubles, it is also hard for those people who served during that period of time, and we have a responsibility to them as well as the families to give them reassurance going forward. And this has a knock-on effect on those people who may be looking to serve in the future. We have seen in Iraq and IHAT the knock-on effect. We are continually looking to judicial responses. If we are continually looking to the law, then people will simply stop signing up because of fears about what will happen to them 30 or 40 years after their service. So these are not straightforward issues by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it was right that the Defence Select Committee explored it, and I am proud of the report that we have done. It raises the issue and puts additional burden on the Minister, and for that I apologise. However, these are issues that we can ignore no longer. We need a settlement that is agreed for all parties, whichever part of the conflict and the troubles they had been part of. Our brave service personnel were acting under orders. We asked them to do many things for us. We need to have their backs when they need us. So, as delicate as this is, and I hope everybody will approach it in the way that my honourable friends led the debate, we now need to move forward. We look to the Minister for guidance, and I hope that the recommendations of the report will be followed.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Sir David. It's a pleasure to serve, to speak under your leadership. I am going to keep my remarks short. I've been struck down by that lethal man flu. It's very dangerous, sort of thing that would have seen the Minister in bed for a week. However, look, on this issue of historical allegations, I mean, I do feel at times that obviously I have a contemporary history in the military, and I have a history around the Iraq Historical Allegations Team, and so on. But I do think we cannot make it clear enough that individuals like me and those I serve with absolutely want to see the rule of law upheld in every nature and engagement that we are involved in. And it is completely wrong to assert that we are looking for some sort of cover-up, some sort of, some sort of enabling of illegal activities. It could not be more wrong. We join up to the military and we become part of it because we believe in it and we believe in that mission and we believe in what we're doing in making the world a better place. However, with this situation, and it's fantastic to come and hear my right honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee, his thoughts on this, because I think we are going to have uncomfortable conversations. We are going to have to intellectually get together and work this out. And why are we going to have to do that? Because it doesn't work for anybody at the moment. The only people that benefit from the current situation are lawyers who I know for a fact are being encouraged to practice in Northern Ireland because they see this issue going on and on and on. And I'm afraid that's not acceptable for the victims, it's not acceptable for the victims' families, and of course it's not acceptable for our armed forces. But we know that. So what are we going to do about it? I think we've seen a couple of options which are really clear and straightforward that on the face of it, but actually represent deep challenges. And I would echo what the chairman of the Select Committee said, in that nobody is going to get a 100% solution out of this. And all I would gently say to those who continue this fight, and I will always continue it because I think it's the right thing to do, but for those who've been going in it far longer than me, is that there will come a time when my generation, whether they served in Northern Ireland, whether they have been affected by crime in Northern Ireland or any of the events, they will want to move on. And the sort of sympathy that is absolutely with those who have suffered wrong, whichever side of the divide they are on, will not last forever. And we have a unique opportunity to come together and work this out and make it work. And so, look, a statute of limitations, I think, is important, but you have to be so careful around how you apply it. The current situation where those involved in the Good Friday Agreement and acting for the paramilitary, 2 years maximum sentence, security forces, it is not the case. That is such a binary issue that is not acceptable. We should have moved on from that. But I have
Thank you very much, Sir David, and as always, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to follow the three different views in many respects, but the three contributions from the three other members, all of whom I know have been incredibly engaged in this issue and thoughtfully considered it throughout the course of the Select Committee inquiry. It's a privilege for me to serve on the Defence Select Committee and to be a part of this inquiry process. But Sir David, when I was listening to our esteemed chairman, and I mean that respectfully, I was thinking of Otto von Bismarck's quote about legislation being a bit like sausages, and you don't need to see how they are made. But he and I have had many private conversations about this report. He knows very clearly that I and my party colleagues are not supportive of an amnesty. He knows very clearly that for many victims in Northern Ireland, victims from wherever they come, be they victims of republicanism, victims of nationalism, victims of unionists or loyalist paramilitaries, or victims of state forces, victims collectively do not believe in an amnesty, nor are they interested in having the hope or the pursuit of justice snuffed out. So that's the environment in which I think it is important to consider this report. And this morning, Sir David, I was listening to Radio Ulster, and there was a contribution from Northern Ireland victims about Holocaust Memorial Day. And one victim, Alan McBride, who lost his wife on the Shankle Road, a lady who went to her local fish and chip shop to get an evening meal, and yet was blown up by the IRA. And he spoke about a day of reflection in Northern Ireland, which is the 21st of June. And I hadn't known this, but he shared the reason the 21st of June was selected. Victims across the province had sought to find one single day in the calendar in which there wasn't a Troubles-related death, and they couldn't. They couldn't find one single day where someone hadn't died as a consequence of the Troubles. They focused on the 21st of June because of solstice and because of a change in the culture and weather and hope and aspiration of warmth and sunshine. But our history is harrowing. It is harrowing. And anyone who has been personally or directly affected by it is left with the scars and is left with the emotion of the troubles of Northern Ireland. This report is about how we, and I'll use the phrase from a previous Defence Select Committee report, how we guard the guardians. How we look after those who protected society in Northern Ireland, not those who persecuted and prosecuted the most heinous crimes in Northern Ireland. 300,000 service personnel served in Northern Ireland. 300,000. 27,000 at their height, and 1,441 members, individuals, human beings that we as a nation asked to serve and protect our interests. They perished. They died. 300 individuals died as a direct consequence of engagement with security forces. 300 people, Sir David, does not mean 300 murders. And I think it is important to make that point. It doesn't mean that 300 people were murdered at the hands of the state. 300 people died engaging against the state. Legitimate deaths, deaths that arose out of conflict, deaths that arose out of those individuals that we asked to defend us, standing in the front line and defending us as best they could.
My honourable friend.
Certainly.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank my honourable friend and his colleagues on the Select Committee for the huge amount of work that I know that they have put into this report and these conclusions. But would my honourable friend agree with me that there is a stark difference between someone who went out with murder on their mind to hurt and to kill in the pursuit of terrorism, and the brave men and women of our security forces and armed forces who went out night after night and day after day to serve and to protect, some of whom were involved in difficult operational decisions with very tragic outcomes. And that is what we should be protecting. Not anybody should be a terrorist on the Loyalist side, a terrorist on the Republican side, or somebody in the armed forces who went out with the intention to murder. That is not what this is about. It's about protecting those who are honourable, who went out to serve and protect.
Thank you, Sir David, and I agree most fundamentally with my colleague from Belfast South. And the Honourable Lady has been engaged for almost a decade in the policy matters and implications that surround legacy issues in Northern Ireland. And I pay tribute to her for the work that she has done, because these are not easy issues. Not easy issues at all. But the 300 deaths, as I say, is not to say that they were murders, nor is it to say that they were unlawful, and nor should it be that those 300 deaths are immune from investigation. And I say that most clearly. They should not be immune from investigation. But I do want to quote from the report, Sir David. And this is a quote from the Who Guards the Guardians. It was led by the Honourable and Gallant Member for Plymouth Moorview into the IHAT inquiry. With the prospect of investigations into British deployments in Afghanistan and Northern Ireland, the Government must prove both in private but especially in public that in adhering to the pursuit of justice and the rule of law, it does not lose sight of its moral responsibility and its commitment to the Armed Forces Covenant and those who serve. And I was disappointed to see that the Government dismissed those lines from the report. When we consider what we have attempted to do in Northern Ireland thus far with dealing with the legacy, I think this report fairly surmises the overall process investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland has been deeply unsatisfactory. The instability of investigatory bodies, limited resources and manpower provided to them, and the continuing question marks over the independence has delivered a vicious cycle of investigation and re-investigation that fails both service personnel and their families and the families of those who died. Dealing with this issue, I respectfully suggest to the Minister, and the Chairman should know my views on this as well, dealing with this issue through the prism of Northern Ireland doesn't work. We, as parliamentarians who stand up in this national parliament, who ask individuals to put their life on the line for our protection and for our security, should not be looking at this issue through the Northern Ireland prism alone. So a consultation's fine, and I have nothing against people submitting their views. But the principles of which we're engaged in here go far beyond, in my view, the Northern Ireland context. And I'm not asking for anything that would be injurious to investigation or upholding the rule of law. When I say that, Sir David, I'm very and acutely aware that there are relatives of the Ballymurphy massacre sitting behind me in the public gallery. Relatives who have sought for years to achieve truth and justice for their loved ones. An incident that took place over a number of days in August 1971. I'd say this just very gently. It applies to their case, and it applies to many other cases in Northern Ireland as well. The pursuit of truth and justice are two noble pursuits. One does not always lead to the other. You can have truth but not get the justice you seek. You can have justice and not get the truth you think you know. So that's the mix that we deal with in Northern Ireland. But a statute of limitations does not, in our view, change the ability to get an investigation, change the ability to get closure, or remove the state's responsibility in what it has to do to be Article 2 compliant. And I do disagree with the Chairman in his remarks about this. 1973 was a watershed when the investigatory process in Northern Ireland was fundamentally changed because there had been questions of the impartiality or the suitability of investigations. A watershed. The state can have confidence that where there have been investigations post-1973, that the system, that the process was robust and was Article 2 compliant. And again, I will acknowledge that with the Ballymurphy massacre families here, 1971 predates that. And I stand not in the way of any victim who seeks to pursue justice for their loved ones. It's wrong to say that a statute of limitations has to be extended to both state and non-state actors. Wrong. Because when we propose a statute of limitations, we are doing it on the basis where the state has discharged its duty. This is not immunity. This is not state immunity. This is not protection for a protected class of people. This is the state saying where there has been an investigation and nothing came of it, we will move on after a defined period of time. And that's why, Sir David, I think the Prism of Northern Ireland is wrong in this context, because that will apply in 4 years' time to Afghanistan. And that will apply in 5 or 6 years' time to Iraq. And a 20-year statute of limitation period could apply to armed conflicts throughout the world, provided we do not deviate from what are international standards. So I don't accept that this has to be all-encompassing or not. And I do draw the distinction between the way in which this government in London created conditions that were preferential for the perpetrators, but seemingly did nothing for the protectors. If we're looking for equivalence in the system, then it doesn't just fall to the 2 years under the early release scheme. That is a key part, and there is a distinction. 2 serving members of the security forces were in prison at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, and they did not benefit from the 2-year release scheme. They did not benefit from it. But the perpetrators of paramilitarism and the heinous acts in Northern Ireland kept no records, have no files, and provide no honesty or truth in a process that could lead to justice for the loved ones of their victims, be they members of the security forces or not. Another clear disparity. But taking this out of Northern Ireland, if you'd asked the Northern Ireland parties to agree to an on-the-run scheme, they would have asked you to run on. But the Labour government did produce an on-the-run scheme that went out of its way to give comfort to those who had committed heinous paramilitary acts that they would not be pursued for prosecution. Now, Sir David, the state, our state, this country, this government has given no protection to the people they asked to engage on our behalf, have given no protection to security force personnel that served in Northern Ireland or in other conflicts, but they were prepared to give odious on-the-run letters to paramilitaries in Northern Ireland. John Downey was a famous example. He killed 11 members of our security forces in Hyde Park and 7 horses associated with their work. And when he was brought to the Old Bailey, he produced an on-the-runs letter. I have an assurity from this state that I will not be prosecuted for my actions, and John Downey walked. There is no parallel with how our state should be protecting the people that we asked to protect us and the way in which there has been a casual or laissez-faire protection for paramilitaries. I think the legal evidence that we received was interesting, it was compelling, but more importantly, albeit there are different views and different ambitions and different perspectives on the Northern Ireland issue, most importantly, our expert witnesses agreed that the UK Parliament has entirely within its own power to enact such a statute, and we call upon government in the next Parliament to do so as a matter of urgency. That's the nature of this report. That's what we're asking for from our government. And whilst there will always be different ambitions and different tactics and different approaches in Northern Ireland is but one part of this process. The decision today, and the decision for this government, is whether they are prepared to redress the approach to legacy, redress the approach to our service personnel, and start protecting those who protected us.
Thank you, Sir David. I thought that speech by my honourable friend, the member for Belfast East, was astonishing and deeply, deeply moving. Thank you. This is personal to me. I'm one of the 300,000 soldiers that served in Northern Ireland. I completed 7 tours there as an infantry officer. I spent 3 years there. I first went in 1970, the early months of 1970. I went as a 20-year-old second lieutenant. To be honest, I was utterly shocked. For the first tour that I took part in, to be operating on the streets of my country with weapons. This was not the sort of soldiering I had expected. After all, I'd been at Sandhurst since 1967. We withdrew from Aden in 1967. We had a year of peace in 1968. And then the British Army was sent into Northern Ireland in 1970. I was very uncomfortable about it, to be honest. And I recall when I went into Northern Ireland just after the start of 1970, we were deployed to Londonderry. And we were deployed principally to protect the Catholics. I remember I even had a Catholic girlfriend for a time. I was unmarried. Thank you, the DUP representative for Strangford. He always gets me. Now, in my 7 tours, I certainly witnessed bombings and fatality shootings involving military personnel. And I want to centre, really, on how we felt and how we approached it. And our approach starts with our instructions. And those instructions were called Opening Fire in Northern Ireland, the so-called yellow card. I still have mine here. This is the 1980 version. It's meant to fit into a pocket, so that soldiers had it with them the whole time. The problem is that when you're in contact, you can't go, oh, goodness, what can I do? It's got to be in here. And it's got to be built into a soldier what he or she should do when there's a case where they might use firearms. It's got to be instinctive. So, in order for people to understand the rules, there was huge instructions on pre-operational tour training. It was pretty precise as to what you could do and what you could not do. The rules were quite clear. As a soldier, let me just give them to you, because it's on one piece of paper. And this had to be in a soldier's mind. You had to use minimum force in all situations. You only opened fire as a last resort. No live rounds were to be carried in the breech unless ordered otherwise or you were about to fire. Challenges were always to be given before firing unless to do so would increase the risk of death or grave injury to you or anyone else you considered was being engaged by terrorists. Challenges were to be clear. Army, stop or I fire. Only open fire, we were ordered, if someone is committing an act likely to endanger life, and there is no other way to stop them. Actually, on the yellow card, there are examples of when you can open fire. For example, someone firing or about to fire a weapon. Someone planting, detonating, or throwing an explosive device, including a petrol bomb. Petrol bombs on the streets of Londonderry in William Street put a third of my platoon in hospital with burns in the early 1970s before any firing took place. We didn't fire. We didn't even consider it. We didn't draw our batons, actually. Someone driving a car at a person, and there is no other way to stop him. Some may be old enough to remember the case of Corporal Lee Clegg in 1993, who was convicted of murder because he'd fired at the car as it approached him, and as it passed by, he turned around and shot through the window. The yellow card is precise. He is not anymore in danger. He should not have fired. I'll come back to that in a minute. Only aimed shots were to be fired. No more rounds than necessary were to be fired. And be very careful not to hit anyone who's innocent. Now, those rules were put into all of us. We practiced them. We spent ages in a classroom learning them. We also practiced them on exercise, and we had scenarios where you were judged to have done or not done the right thing. It was an enormous decision to decide to open fire. And often, and in my experience, I saw it, indecision and worry about whether to open fire resulting in it not happening until it was too late, when fire could have been returned. I had several instances of that happen. We all knew that shooting incidents would be investigated, and you had to justify what you had done. I would be delighted to give way to my honourable friend for Stirling.
My honourable and gallant friends giving a moving first-hand testimony to the soldiering in Northern Ireland and the issues surrounding it. you're describing, the member's describing a situation where something has happened. What impact does this have, in your experience, on the soldier concerned?
Rob Stewart.
Thank you, Sir David. I thank my very good friend, the Honourable Member for Stirling, for that question. Soldiers were frightened sick of going to court. They would much prefer to be in the field rather than to be facing some sort of judicial procedure. In 1986, I was the lead army witness in Belfast Crown Court for the Ballykelly bombings. I had a string of my men going into court behind me. They were petrified, absolutely petrified. They hadn't done anything wrong, they hadn't opened fire, they were just petrified about going to court. And luckily, in the end, what happened was I gave evidence, we had lunch, and they changed the plea. My men did not have to give evidence. But in answer to the question which my honourable friend asked me, they were petrified and loathed it. And not because they'd done anything wrong, but simply because it was so far out of their ken. The trouble is that decisions to open fire had to be made in seconds. And that was against the background of the poor 18-year-old sometimes having to think all the time, he's thinking, am I making the right decision? Is this right? I don't want to kill someone. We are human beings. Soldiers are not brutes. And if they are, they should be out of the army. Yet those questioning soldiers' decisions to open fire always have the luxury of ample time to examine what has happened. Normally in a warm, comfortable room, rather than in an operational situation, where so often soldiers who open fire are frightened sick and having to make a decision very, very quickly. And of course, they're normally in real danger of losing their lives. In all instances that I was involved in, and I'm talking about fatality shootings, those who were involved in the incident had to prove they were acting within the law, very often in court. The Army, the Special Investigation Branch in particular, were not nice to them. There was no cozying up. The interrogations, and such as they were interrogations, were not cosy. In 1978, I remember telling two soldiers that they were to be investigated and possibly charged with manslaughter. They had just saved their own lives by using their pistols to extricate themselves from a deadly situation, and they were shaking from their experience. They accused me, their officer, of abandoning them, and they used pretty ripe language about me. I felt rotten, as I totally understood how they felt. I explained that they had to be investigated to prove that they had acted legally, and the matter would be over forever. I believed then that was right. But in recent years, I've been increasingly worried in case I was wrong. And in that case, I've let my men down very badly by what I said at the time. Now, as politicians, we have a duty to ensure that soldiers, like my two men in 1978, are protected from retrospective investigation if it's happened before, especially into events that we believe were fully investigated at the time and are now long in the past. Thank you, Sir David.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this matter. And can I thank those honourable members who have spoken, and in particular my gallant friend as well, because he is a friend, and we do share a bit of banter on many occasions, but we've also had the opportunity to serve in uniform, and that's something that we both have a recognition of. And also I'd like to thank my honourable friend and colleague for East Belfast, who is also, in his contribution, I think he made probably one of the best speeches I've heard in a long time, one that certainly we all recognise and could resonate with, because it's from his heart, and well done to him as well. I can thank those who have been a part of producing this report. The high quality, the hard work that has went into this report is evident, and on behalf of the right-thinking people of Northern Ireland, those who serve Queen and Country there, thank you. Thank you for investigating with an impartial eye that has not been swayed by any propaganda, and thank you for seeking to do right by those who laid physical and mental health on the line for the safety of each corner of this United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I declare an interest, Sir David, having served in the Ulster Defence Regiment for 3 years and in the Territorial Army for 11.5 years as a part-time soldier. It's always something I've been pleased to serve in uniform. It was something I always wanted to do as a young boy, and the opportunity came when I was 18 and I did so. Thank you. The report is very clear. Between August 1969 and July 2007, over 300,000 soldiers served in Northern Ireland as part of Operation Banner, the longest continuous campaign in the history of the British Army. These soldiers were deployed to support the Royal Ulster Constabulary and other security forces, and at its height more than some 27,000 military personnel operated out of bases in more than 100 locations across the whole of the province. I was one of those men in part-time uniform, and I'm proud to have been so. Operation Banner resulted in the death of 1,441 serving personnel. 722 of those were killed in paramilitary attacks. Over the same period, British soldiers were responsible for the deaths of around 300 people, some of whom were civilians. This fact sets the scene very well. Imagine that all around you, your brothers in arms have been blowing up, trapped, beaten to death. You're under command and order, and you know that the only way of surviving is to keep your head down and follow orders, and you do that. So you see the unbelievable, you touch the untouchable, and 30 years later, after flashbacks of the unforgettable face of death and destruction, you rebuild your life. You raise your children, your grandchildren. You try to return to civilian life. Forget what you've seen. You get to your state pension and settle into retirement, and then one day you get a knock on the door, and someone is preparing a case to prosecute you for following those orders. If they ask you for a description of your colleague's last seconds as he gasped for breath and your arms having been blown up, you could very, very easily describe that. It's irrevocably, indelibly imprinted in your mind. However, asking for details of individual outings and cases will be very, very different. You followed orders. That's the only detail you really needed to know, and as the honourable gentleman in his contribution to it actually outlined exactly what the soldier does. And if you needed any real live evidence of that, the honourable gentleman put that forward in a very, very succinct way. You followed orders. You didn't question an order or ask for a brief on the order given. You followed it. That's the job that you did. And by interviewing these men, we are not seeking justice. We are allowing a minority of people to seek vengeance. Not against specific perpetrators, against anyone who dared to wear a uniform. And that was the only crime, being British and serving the Queen. To this day, that is enough for some people to want to destroy you. The question is, why are some people facilitating that, and how can we stop it? Figures show that investigations into former Army personnel account for a minority of LIB cases. They still amount to a disproportionately high number, some 30%, when compared to the total level of Army involvement in killings, which stands at 10%. I've said it before in this chamber, why is the life of someone killed in a skirmish with the Army worth more time, more effort, more money than the life of someone killed by a Republican terrorist who is unrepentant and is walking around with a Merrill chain around his neck? And we all know cases of where that has happened. I named one in the House of Commons in the last term, and it's very, very clear. It isn't, and it shouldn't be. We must cut off the ability of the litigious Republican agenda, determined to rewrite history, to weave a web of conspiracy theory and collusion to make it seem like that it was ever okay to bring workmen out of a van, let one of a certain religion escape or run, and murdered arrests in cold blood. Kingsmill massacre is very, very real in many, many people's minds over the last period of time. These are the people who some seek to appease by this continued attack on service personnel. It has to end, and for the sake of real justice, it has to stop. By all means, if soldiers lured civilians into an area by means of a honey trap and murdered them, let's investigate that regardless of the uniform. But that is not the way. It was the other way round for the Free Scottish soldiers, and I put an EDM for them there just a short time ago. So where is their justice, I ask? It's not a level playing field, and it needs to be level. Lexi Cummins' family from West Tyrone-sur-Ban need the closure that has been given to those who sought the investigation into Bloody Sunday. My own cousin Kenneth Smith, family still mourn. Do they not deserve the time that has been wasted on dragging old men out of their bed on the mainland and ask questions that was above their pay grade when they simply followed orders in a country where possibly half the people despised them for their uniform, and perhaps half of those people were willing to do something about it? I'm quite happy to, yeah.
Thank you very much, Sir David, and I thank my very good friend, the Honourable Member for Strangford Loch. I just want to pick up on one point my honourable friend said. You said they followed orders. The decision to open fire was an individual matter. You didn't normally open fire because someone ordered you to do so. It was normally, in most cases, the vast majority of cases, I can't think of any, actually, where people opened fire on an order. They opened fire because the decision was made by them based on the yellow card.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. Very clearly the yellow card was given by the British Army for your guidance on what you did, and you followed that, so therefore the rules were followed by the soldiers on the ground. It wasn't a man over your shoulder says, right, fire now. No, you made that decision upon the rules that you had, and they were clearly laid down. I had the yellow card myself, and I still keep it because it's a bit of a keepsake for no other reason. I will say it again. If they step beyond their role and knowingly and willingly committed offences, then that is very different, and that's what's happening here. And that's what's happening here. Please see the difference, Sir David. I conclude with these comments. I support the recommendations of the committee as put forward, with a few minor parts of it which my honourable friend from East Belfast and others have stated, and I wouldn't endorse everything that the chair has said for that reason. But I do appeal to anyone with any sense of decency and natural justice to do the same. Government needs to act. I'm appealing to respond to those who wore a uniform and as one who still lives under the threat, not of prosecution, but my British service life, as others in this chamber, gallant members and very gallant members have said. Please put the resources where they are best met, and that is not persecuting. And I use that word on purpose, and I say that deliberately. Persecuting men who did no more than wear their uniform and follow orders whilst under guerrilla and open warfare. Minister, the decent people have had enough. The serving RUC, the prison service, the UDR, the British Army and their families have been traumatised enough. Please stop appeasing in the minority of people who cannot be appeased until we are, what they would wish to have, are wiped out of their sight to do what is right and honourable for those who so honourably, Sir David, served Queen and country. Thank you very much. I apologise, Sir David, I've already asked for permission, and the Minister and the Shadow Minister to retire very, very shortly. Thank you.
This is Cheryl Murray.
Thank you very much, Sir David, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and follow my honourable friend, the member for Strangford. Mr Amos, I would like to pay tribute initially to my dear friend and late constituent, Surgeon Captain Rick Jolly, who a lot of people will know of his work in the Falklands and the heroic work he carried out there, but some may not know that he served as the medical officer of 4-2 Commando and was deployed in Belfast early in his career. Sir David, I welcome this report by the Defence Committee, and I welcome the contents, but I want to tell the House today a story, a true story, a story of another of my constituents. I first met this gentleman many years ago when I worked as a doctor's receptionist in the NHS in a local village. One day we had a power cut, and this kindly man from across the road came bearing a kettle of water so that we could make a cup of tea. Over the years of working at this location, I got to know my kindly neighbour. His name was Dennis Hutchings, and now, in his late 70s, and he's not a fit and healthy man, he has incurable chronic kidney disease. Over 40 years ago, he was a gallant soldier doing his job in the very difficult sphere which was Northern Ireland. In his own words, it was a war zone. He served for 26 years in the Lifeguards with distinction. During his time in Northern Ireland, he and another soldier were involved in a shooting. I understand that the situation was investigated at the time by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and the soldiers were told they would face no further action. We now come to the present day, over 40 years ago, down the road. One newspaper reported that Dennis was arrested a couple of years ago and interrogated 25 times by the police investigating. It went on to say that he was held for almost 85 hours before he was charged with attempted murder. On one day, he was quizzed 10 times in 11 hours. This is a gentleman who was told there would be no further action at the original investigation. A different newspaper outlined the information available. It said that there is no forensic evidence, no weapons from the time, and all the witnesses are dead. Many have described this as being a witch hunt. This is the real face of these investigations. A kindly, elderly gentleman being hounded by authorities for years just because he did his job over 40 years ago to the best of his ability, and as he was ordered to do so, to serve in Northern Ireland by his country. The government, Minister, said in its response to the report of the Defence Committee that the Armed Forces Covenant is a promise from the nation that those who serve and have served in the armed forces and their families will be treated fairly. And I welcome that as the mother of somebody who serves in the armed forces. I don't think Dennis Hutchings is being treated fairly. Over the years, he's become my friend, he's my constituent, and what is happening to him is wrong. Now, I do sympathise with the families of the victims. I know what it's like to lose a loved one, have them snatched from you prematurely. So I can speak with authority. But Dennis Hutchings is my friend, my constituent, and what is happening to him is wrong. And if the Armed Forces Covenant is to mean anything, then this attack on Dennis Hutchings must stop now. Thank you very much, Mr. Amos.
Mr. Martin Day.
To serve under your chairmanship today in what has been a very interesting and thoughtful debate into the fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel. I'm very grateful to the chair of the Defence Select Committee, the Honourable Member for New Forest East, for his detailed explanation of the committee's deliberations, and I think you would need the wisdom of Solomon to come up with a true solution to this problem, and I do not envy the Minister when he comes to sum up at the end of the debate. We've heard many examples today of how stressful the process has been for the individuals and families involved, many left in limbo while investigations drag on. As we know, the Legacy Investigations Branch of the Police Service for Northern Ireland is currently reviewing all deaths attributable to the security situation that occurred in Northern Ireland between 1968 and the Good Friday Belfast Agreement in 1998. Any decision by the Legacy Investigations Branch to prosecute is, of course, referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions for Northern Ireland, and this is an independent process without UK government involvement. We must have confidence in the institutions of the police and the judiciary in Northern Ireland to serve the people, and it is for Stormont to reform them if they are not serving well. And I certainly hope we can see Stormont functioning again fully in the future. That said, none of us wants our former members of the armed forces, or current members for that matter, to be treated unfairly when accusations of wrongdoing are made. We all know already that the huge backlog of cases in the Iraq historical allegations team meant that serving and former serving personnel faced extended periods of uncertainty over accusations which had been made, and we must have adequate resources for the investigation of allegations so that this does not happen again, or in this case. We all support the idea of justice being done, but that also includes fairness to our armed forces personnel who are entitled to due process in answering allegations made within a reasonable time frame. The Select Committee has very helpfully suggested 4 possible options for government and has made its own recommendation in favour of option 1, the enactment of a statute of limitations. I note that the committee did not recommend the 4th option, to cease investigations into former service personnel to stop complying with the European Court of Human Rights interpretation of our Article 2 obligations. And it is important for me to state the SNP position on this question, that we fully support the Human Rights Act and will oppose any attempts to abolish the Act. Any derogation of Articles 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights as a response to the situation would blur rather than define the high standards that we rightly expect and overwhelmingly deserve to see by our armed forces. So I'm grateful that they do not recommend that course of action. It would send out the entirely wrong message to the rest of the world about our commitment to human rights. In conclusion, I believe that our service personnel should rightly be held to the high standards of behaviour which we expect, but they should also be fully supported by the Ministry of Defence when allegations are indeed made. Thank you.
Mr. Joe. Thank you very much, Sir David. It's indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I start by paying tribute to the chair of the Defence Select Committee and indeed to the members of the committee for their work in producing this report. It's an extremely important issue, as we know, and a profoundly serious issue, and one which is wholly deserving of the committee's attention. I think the chair of the Select Committee today gave a very considered and thoughtful opening contribution to the debate and outlined the Defence Select Committee's approach and obviously the need to consider all views. We heard from my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent North, who talked about the delicate nature of the issues that we are discussing and the delicate nature for families and indeed for armed forces personnel. Hearing from the honourable member for Plymouth Moorview, who gave his contribution with the added knowledge of his military service, and indeed the member for Belfast East, who gave a very moving reflection on the Troubles and reminded us of the complex and delicate nature of the issues we're discussing. And the honourable member for Strangford, who gave his personal reflection of his time in uniform, as did the honourable member for Beckenham, who both as a young infantry soldier serving in Northern Ireland, and finally the honourable member for South East Cornwall, who gave an account on behalf of one of her constituents and the links to the Armed Forces Covenant. I think, Sir David, we know that the past presents many difficult and unanswered questions to families and individuals in Northern Ireland, as well as to those across Britain, including our armed forces veterans who served on Operation Banner. In all communities, there is a desire for truth and clarity about what happened to loved ones, and the quest for answers has not diminished with the passage of time. Like many members across this chamber, I am of a generation that remember the Troubles vividly, as well as the anguish and conflict that the period represented. It is always worth reminding ourselves of the good work that led up to the landmark achievement of the Good Friday Agreement, and we're all committed to a future for Northern Ireland which guarantees peace and security for all citizens. The report before us today deals specifically with the issue of fatalities involving British personnel who served in Northern Ireland. So, David, we rightly expect the very highest standards of conduct from our service personnel. We know that members of our armed forces are keenly aware of this. And where there are allegations about improper or unlawful behaviour, these must be investigated fairly and thoroughly. Of course, there have been cases where investigations have regrettably not been fair. We on the opposition benches welcome the closure of the Iraq Historical Allegations Team because that forum, relying too heavily on referrals from one discredited law firm, was simply not working. But in relation to the separate issue of fatalities in Northern Ireland, we are clear that the best means of dealing with this is through the full implementation of the Stormont House Agreement and the institutions that that agreement provides for. As members know, the Stormont House Agreement addressed many important issues relating to legacy, including providing for an independent historical investigations unit to take forward outstanding investigations into deaths relating to the Troubles. I know that there is deep frustration on all sides about the lack of progress towards fully implementing the agreement. One of the many groups eager to see progress are the Ballymurphy families who met earlier today with my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary for Northern Ireland. I know their desire for progress is shared by all parties. The frustration at the lack of progress is also a point that the committee's report makes only too clearly. And I fully recognise the committee's view that the status quo is simply not sustainable. It's David who's morphed into Mr. Burke. We all want to see progress made in resuming power sharing in Northern Ireland as soon as possible. As my honourable friend, the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, said recently, we need the government to come forward with a clear path to rebuild trust between the parties and restore power sharing, and this should involve the enlisting of an independent chair to manage the talks. Only then, and with the implementation of the Stormont House institutions, can we make progress that we all so badly want to see, and ensure that those affected by the violence of the Troubles get the answers and the truth that they deserve. Thank you.
Minister.
Mark, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I start, of course, by reminding the House of my interest as a member of the Army Reserve, although Northern Ireland is one of the few places that I haven't seen operational service, and I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, the member for New Forest East, both for his committee's thoughtful report on what is a sensitive and a complex issue, and for securing this debate, and indeed for some of the incredibly powerful contributions that have been made this afternoon by the honourable member for Stoke North, who, as we've heard, focused on people, by my honourable friend for Plymouth Moorview, who has been such a champion in this area, and I'm particularly grateful to him for his concern about my health. I not been laid low with man flu, and I would probably say to him gently that as a fine Royal Engineer, if I was, I probably wouldn't seek the sympathy of the committee. I'd just man up and get on with it. To the honourable member for Belfast North, who gave a really passionate speech, and the attention that he got from the House was well deserved, and he highlighted many of the challenges that we all face. My honourable friend Beckenham, who's in his place, who gave such a passionate speech about his own experiences and the pressures placed on our security forces. The honourable member for Strangford, who's had to leave us to go and speak in another debate, and of course my honourable friend for South East Cornwall, who gave a passionate plea on behalf of her constituent, Dennis Hutchings. I would say to her, I think the best way that we can move that forward is if she'd like to come and have a meeting with me, we can perhaps discuss that in more detail. Around 250,000 service personnel served in Northern Ireland as part of Op Banner in the years between 1969 and 2007. Our armed forces played a vital role in providing safety and security and in bringing about the conditions for peace. As the then Bishop of London, Dr. Richard Charteris, put it at the service to mark the end of Op Banner, force cannot in the end resolve social conflict, but can offer a vital breathing space in which the normal processes of democratic debate and decision-making can reassert themselves. Military intervention can hold the forces of chaos at bay while people learn again how communities with very different histories and aspirations can live together and do business with one another,
op banner kept open that vital pass. I pay tribute to all those who served, and especially the more than 1,000 security personnel who sadly lost their lives in doing so, as well as all those who were injured and killed. In total, more than 3,500 people were killed during the Troubles, with terrorists responsible for 90% of those deaths. The arrangements for investigating those deaths have, over the years, been subject to increasing criticism, and there is broad agreement within Northern Ireland that the current systems and structures are not delivering enough for victims, for survivors, or for wider society. The closure of the Historic Inquiries team in December 2014 has left more than 1,000 cases outstanding, the vast majority of which are terrorist killings. The Northern Ireland courts risk being overwhelmed by the demands placed on them by historic inquests, with 50 inquests currently open into almost 100 Troubles-related deaths. Where criminal investigations are currently taking place, this is on a largely ad hoc basis, feeding the concern felt by some that there is an imbalance in the mechanisms currently in place, which results in disproportionate focus on those deaths which in some way involve the state. So the government is clear about the problems with the status quo. After 11 weeks of intensive talks, the Stormont House agreement in December 2014 reached a broad political agreement to establish 4 institutions to address what is sometimes described in Northern Ireland as the legacy of the past. We continue to seek the implementation of the legacy institutions set out in the Stormont House agreement as the best way to address Northern Ireland's past in a way that is fair, balanced and proportionate. The key institution relevant to today's debate is the proposed Historic Investigations Unit, or the HIU. The HIU would be an independent body responsible for completing outstanding investigations into Troubles-related deaths. It would be required to act in a manner that is fair and impartial, proportionate, effective and efficient, and designed to secure the independence of the HIU and the confidence of the public. The HIU would be required to work through its caseload in chronological order and to complete its work within 5 years. In addition to the HIU, it is also clear that action is needed on so-called legacy inquests. In 2013, for example, only 2 legacy inquests were completed and both have subsequently had their conclusions appealed, one successfully. None were completed in 2014. Better progress has been made since, and the government supports the work of the Northern Ireland Lord Chief Justice in putting together a reform plan for legacy inquests for the Northern Ireland Executive. I hope that a new executive can be formed soon in order that it may reach a view on how this element of the package of legacy reform can be taken forward. The government is committed to the Stormont House Agreement and believes that the next phase is to consult publicly on the details of how the new institutions could work in practice. A public consultation will provide everyone with an interest the opportunity to see the proposals and contribute to the discussion on the issues. The consultation will include a draft bill, which I'm sure all honourable members here today will want to scrutinise in detail. But the consultation will also do something else. The Defence Committee's important report, and indeed today's debate, demonstrates that some people believe that the time has come for Northern Ireland to consider an alternative approach to dealing with the legacy of the past, other than through the pursuit of further criminal investigations. The Defence Committee recommended, and I quote, the enactment of a statute of limitations covering all Troubles-related incidents up to the signing of the 1998 Belfast Agreement, which involved former members of the armed forces. This should be coupled with a continuation and development of a truth recovery mechanism, which would provide the best possible prospect to bereaved families finding out the facts once no one needed to be fear of being prosecuted. A subsequent cross-party letter to the Prime Minister signed by the Honourable Member for New Forest East, the committee's chairman, along with Honourable Members for Barnsley Central, North Durham and Plymouth Moorview, went further, drawing on expert evidence that a statute of limitations would fall foul of international law if it were to apply only to servants of the state. And in recognition of the changes made to sentencing for Troubles-related offences by the Northern Ireland Sentences Act, the letter argued that the time had come for a statute of limitations to cover all, including paramilitaries. I know that many, both inside and outside of this place, agree with that position, whilst others, as we have heard, will not. Because there is a range of views, and recognising the view of the committee, the Government has decided to include within the legacy consultation a question on alternative ways of addressing the legacy of the past, such as a statute of limitations or amnesty. Whilst Government is clear that, in its view, the best way forward is to proceed with the Stormont House Agreement institutions, in the spirit of meaningful consultation, all views will be considered carefully to inform the next steps. The Honourable Member for New Forest asked whether the Northern Ireland Sentencing Act applies to members of the security forces as well as paramilitaries. Yes, it does, providing the eligibility criteria set out in the Act are met. In practice, no former members of the security forces have been convicted of relevant offences since the passing of the Act, and so the Act has not yet been used in this way. Equally, the Honourable Member for Belfast mentioned that 2 members of the security forces were in prison at the time of the Good Friday Agreement and did not benefit from early release under the scheme. The soldiers in question were released under licence by the then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who had been considering their case before the Northern Ireland Sentencing Act became law. That case does not demonstrate that members of the security forces are debarred from making use of the provisions of the Northern Ireland Sentencing Act. And back to the consultation, while all views are important, I am particularly keen that Armed Forces veterans are given an opportunity to have their say. So I will ensure that the consultation, once published, and I hope that it will be soon, is distributed to veterans, including through our network of excellent regimental secretaries. Finding a better way to address Northern Ireland legacy matters is a priority for the UK Government. The Defence Committee's report is an important contribution to the debate as to how to best do so, and through the forthcoming consultation, now is the time for everyone with an interest in addressing Northern Ireland's past to have their say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buck, and it only remains for me to express my gratitude to everyone who's taken part in this debate today. I hope that any onlookers will realise and accept that we are dealing here with the most difficult of issues, and we are trying to do everything that decent people with good intentions can do to arrive at a fair conclusion. I'm grateful to those who've spoken today. I'm grateful to colleagues like my honourable friend for North Wiltshire and my right honourable friend from Newbury, who have in the past been highly active in this field but couldn't be here today, for writing in their support. And I'm grateful to the Minister, not least, for making crystal clear the fact that the Sentencing Act does indeed apply equally to the military as it does to terrorists going on trial. Having said that, it remains absolutely unacceptable that service personnel will have to go through the sort of ordeal that Dennis Hutchings is going through at the moment. And it seems to me that there are only 2 ways that one can prevent that. One is to get rid of the international law that requires such matters to be investigated in the way that it does, or the other is to have a statute of limitation. The international law, namely the Human Rights Act, says that if we have a statute of limitation, it must apply to everyone. And I see my good friend, the member for Belfast East, dissenting from that proposition, but that is the testimony that we were given by legal experts. If there is a way in which we can do what the report does, which is to say we support a statute of limitations for service personnel and analogous organisations like the police and the security agencies, and if we can somehow legally do that without incurring a breach of international law, then I'd like to know how that can be done, because I will give way, because the evidence that we were given was that we couldn't.
I'm very grateful, Ms. Bugg, and I realise that it's probably improper for me in a concluding to start a new debate, but the distinction is whether there has been an Article 2 compliant investigation or not. If there has not been, then the right honourable gentleman is right. But where there has been, then the option of a statute of limitation is open.
say we sought the advice. The advice we got was that a statute of limitation can be brought in, but there has to be, or have been, as he says, an investigation. That has not always been the case, and therefore, unless or until we can bring in such a statute, or unless or until we can get out of the provisions of that Human Rights Act, which no one seems to want to do, then we face this prospect of people like Dennis Hutchings being forced to go through a process at a late stage of their lives, which most fair-minded people would regard as unacceptable and which are unlikely to lead to a conviction. As I say, I did not expect for one moment that we would be solving this problem today. I hope, nevertheless, that we have clarified the issues and that we have focused the government's attention on what needs to be done so that we do not end up in a situation where our soldiers have to worry not only about warfare, but about lawfare as well.
The question is that this House has considered the 7th report of the Defence Committee investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel, HC 1064, session 2016-17, and the government response, HC 549. As many of that opinion say aye, the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.